All right, everyone. So to be respectful of everyone's time, I'd like to welcome Ms. Kemi Biastes from Present Age Ministries to lead this presentation about human trafficking, some of the signs and ways that we can hopefully help to combat human trafficking. So, Ms. Biastes, I'll turn it over to you, and we will be recording this for students. And I look forward to learning more about this topic.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for having me this morning. As mentioned, I am Kemi Biastes. I am with Present Age Ministries. I am going to try to share my screen here, so hopefully the magic happens. Looks like that should be it. Look good so far?
It looks like it's loading. Yep, there it is now.
All right, slowly but surely we'll get there. My computer's having a Monday morning, so just give me a little grace on that. We'll get there. But like mentioned, I work with Present Age Ministries. I will just give you a little bit about my background, and I've been with Present Age Ministries for about 3 or 4 years now. I started out as a volunteer and knew this was something I was passionate about. Didn't necessarily want to work directly with survivors. It's, not really my sweet spot. And so I joined our advocacy team, which is where we go out in the community and essentially do things like this, where we talk about what human trafficking is, those warning signs, how to identify it, and then what do you do? So I've been on the team for a few years. Prior to that, I had a security role where I was stationed around the US. And again, I knew that I was interested in trafficking and wanted to learn more. So wherever I was stationed, I essentially looked around to see who was doing it well. When I landed in North Carolina, again, same thing. I was looking to see who was doing it well and found Present Age Ministries. And to be honest, in my perspective, this is the best organization I've ever seen that works with children, that does what they do. So I'm blessed now to get to be on the team. And I've been on staff in this role as our communications coordinator now for about a year, just over a year. So it's just a little bit about how I got here. We'll just go ahead and jump in. So this morning, we're not necessarily going to talk about anything confidential, or at least I won't be sharing anything confidential. I do see a few familiar faces in here this morning, which is really exciting to me. That also tells me I'm not the only one in the room that knows about human trafficking. So if anyone else wants to jump in and come off mute and share some perspective, please feel free to do that. This is definitely one of those things that it's easier to talk through situations rather than go through a list in a PowerPoint. So if you have questions as we go, definitely feel free to use the chat feature, or if you'd rather come off mute and have a discussion, this is going to be a very casual one this morning. So definitely feel free to do that. And then again, as that confidentiality, just knowing moving forward, within Present Age Ministries, we do work with minors. So a lot of our information is confidential. So if you chose to come to one of our deeper trainings, we would share some of that confidential information. But again, in this meeting, we're not really going to address any of that can't be shared publicly. So let me tell you just a little bit about our mission. We exist to combat the sexual abuse, exploitation, and trafficking of teen girls. So before we go any farther, let's talk about those definitions a little bit. So we'll legally get into the definition of trafficking here in a minute. But before we even get there, let's talk about what is abuse, exploitation, and trafficking. So just easy ways to remember, abuse is one-to-one, right? So that's 2 individuals involved, one-to-one contact. We also have to remember that's also content, right? As the world is turning more digital, it's very common now for people to send pictures or videos or whatever that looks like. Also knowing there can be sexual abuse through content. So just keep that in mind. I think especially as older generations, if you're over 35, you could probably remember a time without a cell phone, right? Let me we'll talk in depth about social media later, but I just have a question real quick. Let me just see, for those of you who have your camera on, how many people have Facebook? Okay, how many of you guys have Instagram? Perfect. Okay, of Facebook or Instagram, how many profiles do you have? Reality is most of us have one, right? It doesn't seem like a trick question, but if we were in a room full of 7th and 8th graders, reality is their answer, most common answers are between 7 and 10 profiles. That's for Instagram only. That doesn't include Snapchat or all the other apps that we can't keep up with. So when we talk about that digital content and online content, our younger generations have a very different mindset of what that even means and looks like, right? If you ask, most of our young people, how many friends do you have? Who are your friends? They're going to talk to you about people they interact with online. And so for us, it's kind of people who maybe haven't grown up that way or don't fit into that category. It's a little bit harder to naturally think that way. And so when I talk about abuse, we do want to just point out even recognizing that content is getting more and more common. So as I mentioned, I do work with minors, those young people. This does translate to adults as well. But just to really drive this point home, we had a child in our prevention program recently, and she shared with us, she had some pictures on her phone that her parent found, and that's how, she kind of moved into our prevention program. And she told us during one of our meetings, she said, nudes are the new first base. She's 12. Right? So that's the society that they're growing up in. Again, very digital, digital based and digital interactions. And so recognizing when that's appropriate and when that's not. So moving on from abuse, let's talk about exploitation for just a second. So exploitation, you still have that one-to-one, two people involved, right? But when we see that word exploitation, essentially that means there's an exchange that's happening. So again, as adults, we tend to think, this is probably cash, right? A lot of us think this is going to be an exchange of money. Yes, sometimes, but again, in the world of teenagers, it can be anything a teenager cares about. So if that is getting nails done or hair or shoes or that new dress that mom said I can't have because it doesn't cover anything, right? But maybe it's whatever that teenager cares about that perpetrator could really kind of manipulate their way in there. And so exchange would be when the exchange of value. That's the legal definition, says anything of value. So that also can be food or shelter or anything kind of in that category as well. Trafficking usually means there's that third party involved. So we've moved from the one-to-ones, from two people involved. Now we have that third party facilitator that's basically the one receiving, right? So that trafficker, perpetrator, sometimes the word pimp is used, right? So that third party facilitator is the one who is receiving the benefit from the exchange. And then we have that victim and buyer in the situation. So generally, that's what those terms mean. As we talk about it for minors, trafficking actually is defined as any commercial sexual act, right? Which would be anything like exploitation. So any sexual act in exchange for those under the age of 18 is automatically trafficking. They don't necessarily have to have that third party involved. So we'll just keep moving here. I will show you our community connections here. This is basically, I'm not going to read all of these to you. You can kind of look through them. But my point in showing you this is that Present Age Ministries did not just wake up this morning and decide we wanted to do this. We are very well established in the community. We've been around for coming up on our 13th anniversary. So we've been here for about 13 years now in this local community. Again, we sit on local task forces, state task forces. One that's not on this list, we recently joined the North Carolina Demand Reduction Task Force to kind of also talk through those issues on the demand side, which we'll talk briefly about that today. But again, my point here is just to show you that we've been around for a little bit and we work well with others. So let's talk a little bit more about human trafficking, what this looks like in our area. How many of y'all have seen the Taken movie? Have you guys seen that one? It's getting a little outdated. We need to update this. But okay, so quite a few of us have. If you haven't seen it, essentially what happens is Liam Neeson's daughter goes on a trip and she gets kidnapped, very violent, taken away from her setting and is then taken across country borders and sold into sex slavery, right? So my question is that human trafficking? Yes, it is, right? Is that what human trafficking looks like in our local area? No, no, it's not. And so when we talk about human trafficking, we want to make sure to dispel some of those common myths that, maybe we see in the news or maybe we see kind of in movies. That's not what we see on a regular basis. So out of our hundreds of girls, I think we've worked with about 300 identified survivors, but at this point, that's a very low number, but those are identified as trafficked, right? So that means we got to that place where either law enforcement or at some point this was categorized. This is not just a situation where we can infer trafficking happened. So that would be identified survivors of trafficking. So anyway, we have out of 300 girls that we've worked with, 0 were initiated with kidnapping. So when we think about stranger danger or that creepy white van, that's not what's happening anymore. So we want to always just address that, kind of here near the front. These other images here, excuse me, we also used to use these in our marketing, and we've really stopped doing that. Again, we have a responsibility when we are talking to the community in events like this. We have a responsibility to tell the truth, right? These images are very emotionally stirring, but the reality is they don't look like this, right? And so if we are using these images, then it would be us telling you this is what it looks like. And if you're walking around and you don't see a girl in chains, then you're going to miss it, right? If you don't know what you're looking for, we're not going to actually see what's really happening in our community, because you will interact with them, right? A few years ago, when I started doing this with Present Age Ministries, I would say if you interact with them, right? At this point, the reality is when in our community. Since the pandemic started through the end of 2020, so about March 2020 through December 2020, we saw a 46% increase in referrals of identified survivors. So what I'm saying is it's not slowing down, right? So far in 2021, our numbers are even bigger than that. So when we have images like this, we want to make sure that it's accurate, that our marketing is all accurate. So as we go through here, I just want to make sure we're all clear on the terms that I'm using. So as I talk about trafficker, pimp, or perpetrator, all of those terms are synonymous. Also facilitator is kind of another common term for that. Again, that would be that person who is facilitating the interaction, who is benefiting from the interaction. Victim, survivor, and client are also all synonymous terms that we'll use. For us, we are a nonprofit, and so we are basically on the end of the spectrum where usually law enforcement's already involved and has identified and recovered that individual. Then we have, maybe Atrium Health is involved or Novant or, some medical services there. And then, we usually kind of come up and bring up the end process where they actually get to do, some of that trauma-informed therapy and those type of services with us. So by the time they get to us, we really are working through a lot of that empowerment and healthy mental health type of interactions. And so we like to use the term survivor, especially when we are working directly with the individual. If we are working with some of our other service providers, sometimes we'll use the term client, which is more appropriate, right? That's what our counselors or therapists would use. And so we'll use that verbiage. But reality is when we're talking with law enforcement, we can't use the term client. That makes no sense to them, right? We can't use the term survivor because there's a victim and a perpetrator. Everybody survived, right? So to them, that doesn't translate. So in those situations, we would use the term victim. Again, we don't like to use that directly to that child or to that individual, but just to be clear, when it is appropriate with law enforcement, those type of things, or sometimes in trainings to be clear, we'll identify with that term. So those are all synonymous, but just kind of the times that we would use them. And then we do have that buyer. It is also very common to refer to them as a John. I hate that so much because the reality is that normalizes what's happening, right? And it's not a normal thing. Buying sex of children is not a normal thing. And so calling it, that buyer a John is not something that we want to normalize. And then the last term here I want to talk about just briefly is prostitution. Again, we work with kiddos, but we still have kind of a lot of misconceptions about the age of consent and how all of that works. If a minor has any commercial sex act happening, there's any exchange for sex, right? Any exchange of something of value, it is automatically trafficking. There's no such thing as child prostitution, right? Legally, there is no such thing. Even, when we talk about that age of consent here in the state of North Carolina, that is the age of 16, right? So what happens with those 16 to 18-year-olds where they can consent? Well, reality is, and legally, they cannot consent to commercial sex. So commercial sex under the age of 18 is always illegal. No such thing as child prostitution. Clear on that? Perfect. So we talked a little bit about demand. Reality is, in our community, we have hundreds of girls that have come through our program as identified trafficking survivors, right? At this point, we know the vulnerability is there, and we'll talk about that a little bit, some of those common vulnerabilities we see among those, clients or victims that come through our program, as well as those adult services that we work with. So there are those common vulnerabilities, but reality is also there's a huge demand in our community. So if we think about that, if we have one child that comes to us and she says 5 times a week, she was sold 10, 12, 15 times each day or each night, that's a big number already, right? Then we multiply that by 30 to 50 girls at a time. That is a huge demand in our community. So that would be someone on the other side purchasing this consistently, right? So we also want to just make that point and realize it's not just the victims, we also have a massive demand in our local community. So there are 2 forms of trafficking. We do have sex trafficking and labor trafficking. The government also defines human trafficking as organ harvesting. We have not encountered that very commonly, but more on the global scale, that is definitely an issue. Today, we are focusing on sex trafficking. We do have a labor trafficking issue here in North Carolina as well, but today we're primarily talking about sex trafficking. So just to be clear about that. So now we're going to talk about the federal law for just a moment. Again, this is passed in 2000. The Trafficking Victims Protection Act was one of those first big federal laws that really made a change in the anti-trafficking movement. So basically what happens, this law defines what human trafficking is. And not only that, but it actually breaks it into 2 tiers. So for those over the age of 18 and for those under the age of 18. So for those over the age of 18, if there is commercial sex and force, fraud, or coercion, then we have a trafficking situation. If the individual is under the age of 18, any commercial sex act is automatically trafficking. So that's defined very, very clearly at the federal level. And again, that was passed in 2000. I think the latest amendment was in 2018. So it's one of those very consistent laws that we refer back to. Again, talking through commercial sexual exploitation of children, this is just another term. We already talked about exploitation a little bit. Commercial is very similar. When you see that term commercial or the term exploitation, usually we're saying there's an exchange happening. Again, that exchange can be anything of value. And then at the North Carolina state level, we do have several laws, but this one here reiterates exactly what the federal law says. Anyone over the age of 18, there is that forced fraud or coercion present. If it is for someone under the age of 18, that does not have to be present. Any commercial sex act is trafficking. So North Carolina law and federal law both state that very clearly. North Carolina law also goes on to define the penalties, which is fantastic, makes that very clear. And then it goes on to say mistaking of age is not a defense to prosecution. It also says consent of a minor is not a defense to prosecution. So it goes on to make those very, very clear. This was a huge, huge win to make this absolutely very clear at the state level. So when we talk about sex trafficking, we've talked a little bit about, that exchange that has to happen, that third party, if it's over the age of 18, and what a commercial sex act is. Again, that would be something in exchange for something of value. Now, when we talk about force, fraud, and coercion, again, that is for those over the age of 18, but let's talk about it so that we understand it. When we say force, this is pretty much what we mean by like that Taken movie, right? There's usually that kidnapping, that could be force, maybe something with weapons, physical harm, physical restraint, that type of thing is what force looks like. Again, majority of our girls, we very rarely see this. And if we do see force used in a situation, it's not initiated that way. Fraud being that second category, much more common. So what we see in our local community, the most common false promises that are made are something along the lines of, wow, you are so beautiful. Why don't you come be in my music video? Wow, you are so beautiful. How about you come to my modeling agency and we'll take some pictures and you'll be a model. Why don't you come be a model for me? Right? And what 13-year-old doesn't want to hear she's beautiful? What 30-year-old doesn't want to hear she's beautiful, right? And so when we have young people that necessarily may already have vulnerabilities, already have broken boundaries, which we'll talk about in a moment, often those lies don't even have to be really good ones. Most of us know here, in Rowan County, Mecklenburg County even, we don't necessarily have a huge hub of, making music videos, right? We can pretty well rationalize that this is not LA or Hollywood or, Miami even, but again, for a 12-year-old, a 13-year-old who doesn't necessarily have that experience or the mental capabilities to process through all of that, they probably are not going to come to the same conclusion. So fraud is false promises or deceitful behavior. Again, what that looks like mostly in our world is, you're so beautiful, come be a model or come be in my music video. Very common. This last one here, coercion, is a little bit more complex. It can include threats to the family, threats of harm. What this most often looks like in, our local community is blackmail. So I'll tell you a story just to kind of drive the point home and make it a little bit more clear. So we had a client, she did not actually have a lot of those most common vulnerabilities that a lot of our kiddos have. She was a straight A student at school, 2-parent home, very affluent family. And so she was actually staying after school, getting some tutoring and to keep that straight A's. And so she was getting some tutoring. She had a few minutes before mom was going to pick her up after her tutoring. And so she decided to walk down the road to the convenience store. So just a couple blocks, she walks down there, gets some chips and a soda before mom comes to pick her up. So while she's there, she meets somebody. He's only a couple years older than her. She's probably about 14 at the time, and I think he's 19. So he's not like old and creepy. She would have known better than that, right? And so he starts talking to her, telling her she's beautiful and she's so sweet and cute, and he's charming. And so she starts talking to him, and he says, well, why don't we meet here again next week? And she says, okay, yeah, I could do that. Right. And so he starts building this relationship with her, and very quickly turns into her boyfriend. Right. Most of us, again, from the outside can recognize something's wrong here. This is not appropriate at this point. Right. He exposes her to alcohol, to marijuana, to sex for the first time. She's never encountered any of these things in her world. And so this is all very new to her. And then at one point he says, I want to introduce you to my friends. And she's so excited because she thinks she's finally arrived. He totally loves her. He's totally, into this relationship with her and really excited to meet his friends. She feels like she's, kind of making that next big step in their relationship. So he takes her to a neighborhood that she's very unfamiliar with. She doesn't know where she is. And he tells her, they park in front of a house, and he tells her, go inside and I want you to do these things for these men in there. And she says, no. And he says, yes, you're going to do it. She says, nope, I'm not. He says, yes, you are. They go back and forth for a little bit. Right. At one point, he pulls out his phone and he shows her pictures of her that, basically during a sexual encounter that she didn't know he took. Right. Well, he says, I'm going to send this to your whole family, and I'm going to tell your dad what a little whatever you are. And unless you go in and do this for me. That's what coercion looks like. And to be honest, most of our girls at this point, this is where they say, I am so ashamed. I don't want my family to know. And traffickers and perpetrators are very good at manipulating and causing that shame as well. And so most of the time, this is the point where individuals will say, okay, I'll do it, right? But this individual, she actually didn't at this point. So she actually pushed back and said, I guess then I'm going to have some explaining to do to them. And so she held her ground there. But then he took out a picture of her little sister because he had been around enough to figure out her family and see what she posted on social media. And so he had a picture of her little sister, and he said, if you don't go do this, I'm going to make your little sister do it. At this point, she was fearful. She didn't know how to navigate out of the situation. And that's where, this turned into a trafficking situation. That's a little bit of what coercion looks like. It's a just very.
Cami, real quick,
Yeah.
We just had a question in the chat.
Perfect.
Julian, would you like to unmute and ask Cami your question?
Yeah, it was from earlier part. Hold on, I gotta reread it. So I think you mentioned something about like law enforcement helping survivors of sex trafficking and just general human trafficking and like getting like protection and safety and whatnot. But there's probably equally, if not like some degree more of stories where survivors have to avoid the police either because of terrible encounters, lack of actual care or action done with their case, or even just police facilitating in the practice of trafficking. So do groups like the ones you're a part of, or just general like I guess like hotlines for assistance, have any way to combat this problem?
Love that question. Fantastic. Thank you, Julian. Yes. So 100% of the girls that we encounter are afraid of the police. There's this fear that is ingrained in them by that perpetrator or by that trafficker. So often there are those lies, and we'll kind of address those other parts as well. But kind of that first level, and what we see the most is that there's a distrust because that perpetrator has said, you are the one committing a crime, not me. So if the police get you, they're coming after you, not me. I didn't do anything wrong, right? You're the one who's out there being a prostitute or whatever lies they tell them, right? So there's this fear of law enforcement built into it. The other aspect is a lot of them, like you said, there are those encounters with law enforcement where law enforcement are not doing what law enforcement should be doing, and they're not actually protecting. And so we do have that as well. The positive side for us and our organization, again, we've been around for a long time and we sit on a lot of those task forces. We usually are able to, if there is an issue with law enforcement, for example, if one of our survivors, discloses that there was a, buyer that's law enforcement or, anything like that, we also partner really closely with the FBI. And so we're able to kind of use those different resources according to what's appropriate. We also have connections with, some of those other entities, we'll say that. And so if there is that issue, then we can address it. Our executive director also has no issue going after somebody's job when that happens. And so we are more than happy to address it. And the other aspect is we generally don't assume the individual is lying, right? Now, because these individuals have lived such intense lives, usually they do have a lot of those social skills where they can kind of navigate situations that maybe most of us don't even understand what quite they're doing, but we take it at face value. And so if someone does disclose something like that, some organizations have different policies, but generally we're going to assume that it's true and move forward as if it is, right? So we do have those situations. We have had an individual tell us, she was, obviously in this situation, and she was, I think 13, and she obviously was encountering stranger after stranger after stranger after stranger. And so one thing that she did to kind of make herself feel more comfortable and feel like at least I know this person is she would ask them what they do for a living, the buyers. And so oddly enough, they would answer her. And she also thought that was strange, but they did. And so she told us she would encounter everybody, right? Pastors, lawyers, teachers, law enforcement. And she even had a DSS worker come to her at one point. And she said, I thought he was there to rescue me. I thought he was there to help me. And he wasn't, right? So with that individual, it took us a long time to build trust, right? And fair enough, why wouldn't it? So for us, from our perspective, that's kind of the way we would handle those situations is we know that does happen. Again, the majority of the time, that's not what our clients experience. Usually it's the lies from the perpetrator that said, you do something wrong, law enforcement is going to get you. Or law enforcement is uninformed and they do pick up this individual as a, prostitute or prostitution charges. but then realize that they're underage and have to let them go. Traffickers also know that. So essentially traffickers will build that loyalty in that relationship and say, as long as you don't tell on me, law enforcement has to let you go. They can't charge you with anything. So law enforcement generally does, if they pick up somebody, realize that, they are a minor. Obviously, they can't charge them with prostitution. Now we have a better system as a community. Present Age Ministries is actually written into community response protocol. And so when there is suspicion of trafficking, now that we're kind of having these conversations better of there's no such thing as child prostitution, right? We now have community protocols where if law enforcement does pick up somebody, rather than taking them to a holding facility or detention center or something like that, protocols now to take them to Levine Children's Hospital, hold them there, and Atrium is required to call Present Age Ministries and loop us in at that point. Also, DSS is required to get pulled in at that point. So we are getting better as a community at addressing those things. But Julian, does that overall answer that question?
Sorry, just, yeah, for the most part.
Okay.
I have a question.
Yeah, absolutely.
For commercial sex, is it more just like strangers, the teenagers meeting strangers, or could it be family members? Or
Great question. What we primarily see is it can be family members, it can be anybody. But what we primarily see is that one of the vulnerabilities that is most common is previous sexual abuse. So like, we're gonna just take it back a step and talk through the whole thing, right? So if there is previous sexual abuse, statistics from child advocacy centers and these different organizations, also statistics generally say this happens before the age of 5 years old and by a person that they know. So if we think about what that does to a child, right, that's some crossed boundaries already. So by the age of 5, we have some boundaries that have been crossed. That individual doesn't know what healthy boundaries are anymore, again, by the age of 5. Sometimes there's those lies tied to it that is, well, this is what love looks like, right? Because I love you, this is what's happening, right? And so by the time that individual is 11, 12, 13, that door of crossed boundaries is wide open, right? And so that individual doesn't necessarily know that love does not look like that. And so when a trafficker or perpetrator or boyfriend comes along and says, I love you, this is what I want you to do, it's a wide open door already because those boundaries have already been crossed. At that point, it can be family members, absolutely. Sometimes there's that picture that there has to be movement or transportation. It absolutely can be happening in the home. We have seen that in our local area. Right now, what we see most common, especially in 2021, is they're meeting online. If they did not already know each other, they're meeting online and through social media. What we see now, and I think what traffickers have learned, is that they used to have to go to a high school football game and kind of interact with people there and build that relationship that way. Now what I think traffickers have realized is that they can talk to 10, 15, 20 individuals on social media at the same time and never leave their couch, right? And so it's so much easier to just like everybody, like all of their pictures, and then, wow, you should be a model, right? Wow, you're so beautiful, you should be my girlfriend. Why don't I buy you that dress that mom said you can't have? I see that you keep posting about these shoes. Why don't I just get those for you, right? And so it's become a lot easier for traffickers to navigate those relationships rather than having to do it in person. And I think they've learned that. So we do have some of that familial, some of the, they've known them for a long time, the neighbor, the friend, family friend, whatever that looks like. But primarily, if they didn't already know them, it's going to be through social media.
okay.
Jeremy, did you have a question?
Yes, I have a friend that works with Cabarrus County Sheriff's Department. She has worked some of the operations that they have involving human trafficking, and she's talked to me a little bit about how having the speedway here, having the football stadium, having the basketball stadium, and all of these big, huge events that happen in Charlotte create a lot of demand for human trafficking. And how does that work? How does that create the demand, and what's the dynamic there?
Fantastic question. So I'm actually just going to stop sharing my screen because we're having some great conversations here, I think. essentially what that looks like, there are a couple reasons that we have a really high demand. So actually, let me do this. We're just gonna, oh, perfect, we're right here. All right, here's a heat map of the United States. So we can kind of see what's happening. You can see kind of in that eastern corridor, we have a lot of movement going up and down there on the East Coast. You can see kind of over on the West Coast, there's some of those hot spots. This is not a perfect map, but it's a good idea of what's happening out there. So when we talk about North Carolina is actually number 11 out of 50 states, worst states for trafficking. So at number 11, like you said, one of those issues is that we have the speedway. And this within the state of North Carolina, the Charlotte metro area is number 1 for the state. So not Raleigh, not anything else. It's our area that is number 1 within the state, and then the state ranks number 11. So when we think about why that would be, there's a couple different factors there. As you mentioned, one of them is we have big events. So we have the speedway. If you think about the sporting events that happen, we have all of these different football team, basketball team, right? We have the Charlotte Knights. We have, all of these different sporting events that bring in people. So when we say bring in people, majority of what that looks like in our local area, not necessarily a ton of girls are brought in. Sometimes, usually that would be more bigger events like the Super Bowl or something like that. But we have consistently a lot of events. And so what that means is buyers are coming to town. And essentially, anytime there's a lot of disposable income, there's an influx of trafficking, right? Let me say also men gathering around. That's going to be that third factor there. But there are quite a few different factors. Does anyone else have any thoughts about what else might make North Carolina or the Charlotte area hotspot?
This might be off base, but I think because there's so many like highways and interstates that it's easy to move people in and out.
Absolutely. So we are right between, kind of right in the middle of Miami and New York. And so we're a nice little stopping ground right there. We're also not far from Atlanta. And so having 85 and 77, just as you're saying, that transportation in and out is pretty easy. Anyone else have thoughts?
Kind of in that same vein, Charlotte Airport being a hub for American Airlines and some of those bigger airlines, does that factor in as well with transportation?
Absolutely it does. Yep, international travel in and out. Yes, it does. Some other common ones we'll see, military bases. Again, kind of that high frequency, and then high frequency of male-dominated areas. And then we also see in Charlotte, what industry is huge in Charlotte? We have a ton of banking, right? And so again, that's a lot of that high income, disposable income. And so it's very common. Our girls will tell us, that they're brought into the uptown area and have a lot of their transactions in that area. So we're going to just go ahead and skip ahead on some of these things. We already talked about this briefly, but just reiterating here, if they don't already know that potential trafficker, they're meeting on social media. We are seeing this more and more common in the adult space as well. Again, with kiddos, if they have 8 Instagram platforms and 5 Snapchats and, have a ton of that online interaction, they're going to be at higher risk. We also know that traffickers go intentionally seek those younger individuals rather than, people my age. So social media, gaming is a close number 2. We used to see gaming mostly with boys, mostly with males. Now that is really shifted in that females are targeted just as often. And again, that can be under the age of 10. And so that's not necessarily just those teens, but even in, games that are built for the really little guys. Erotic massages, escort services, these are very common in our area. These are, again, mostly with those adults because we work with minors. We don't see that as much, but very, very, very accurate for our area. Public events and public places and large events, not as common since the pandemic, just because so much has shifted online, but still does happen and bring that influx like we talked about a little bit before. So victims can be a little bit of everybody. I am going to sit here for a second and just our top 3 vulnerabilities that we see. This is, based on a assessment is from Kaiser Permanente. It's used in a lot of kind of trauma related industries. And so it started in the medical field. We also use that same assessment. And so out of those top 10 childhood experiences, essentially, these are what are most common. We see a lot of parent separation, sexual abuse, and emotional neglect. Our executive director would say 100% have previous sexual abuse. Reality is, though, most of them are not going to verbalize that or disclose that in a way that we can legally note it. Although it's very clear from our perspective that it has happened, right? So that statistic is not 100% for that reason, because we're not going to mark it unless, again, having that integrity on the backside, we're just going to make sure that we are accurate. But parent separation, that would be one parent not involved in their world, and emotional neglect. We talked about most of these already. I just want to hit a couple. Not all traffickers have to be male. There are females. We've seen a high school cheerleader traffic other high school cheerleaders. Again, all females there. So although there are most common, where that's the older male trafficker, not always. That's not always how that works. Also, one of those big myths is that these kiddos are delinquent or bad. And we just want to make sure we address that they are not. Sometimes they make bad choices, but the reality is when you can see their circumstances and understand where they're coming from, it makes sense why they make the choices that they make. The other thing here I want to spend a moment on is that there is recognition of the crime. They generally do not self-identify. They're not going to say, hey, I've been trafficked, right? So we go into the schools and we talk to those 7th and 8th graders about this. We go into youth groups and we talk to kiddos about this. But even when there is a situation, most of the time they don't recognize it, right? They can't see it in their own world. So they're not going to come running up to healthcare workers or law enforcement. We talked about law enforcement already, of the reasons why. But they're not going to come up and ask for help most of the time until they understand what's happening. So for us, usually what happens is law enforcement will recover an individual, or maybe someone in the healthcare system catches the situation. Maybe DSS becomes aware of the situation. Maybe just a pastor at a church or a community member alerts us, a neighbor, a friend. Either way, however we get involved, often what happens for us statistically, it takes about 6 to 9 months of that individual being removed from the situation, removed from their trafficker, to realize they were the victim of a crime. So for them, most of it is that coercion, that manipulation, that loyalty that has been, manipulated. At that point, they really are saying, that's my boyfriend. He loves me. And we say, honey, no, right? And so once we usually walk with them for about 6 to 9 months, we can get to that place of recognizing, oh yeah, he did use me. Oh yeah, that person was using me, right? So reality is they're not going to come running up and asking for help. When we do those presentations, we do break down those definitions, just like I did at the beginning, exchanging, and breaking down abuse and those kind of conversations. That's when usually that light bulb goes off for the first time, and kiddos then disclose, actually, what you explained, I think has happened to me or is happening. And we get involved at that point. But again, just recognizing most of them are not going to self-identify is going to help us in the long run. So we'll spend a few minutes here just going over warning signs, and then we'll just have questions and discussion time. We already talked about fear of law enforcement. As Jillian mentioned, it's exactly right, very common. Numerous inconsistencies in their story. This may not be that they're lying to you. This is with adults as well. It's actually a sign of complex trauma as well. We see this a lot, sometimes, we'll see someone on the witness stand and, they cannot quite get that story out in a chronological order. Well, the way that the brain works, the factual information and sensory information are stored in 2 different places. So sometimes those things don't quite overlap when there's been complex trauma. And so for them to get that story out in a cohesive, chronological order, may not be that they're lying or trying to manipulate the situation. It could just be complex trauma. truancy from school, again, we work with minors, so that's, one of those protections is that we do have eyes and ears in the community at school. If they are overly tired, it could be as simple as because they're out all night, right? We had a situation where a trafficker would come and he gave a device to the child and said, anytime I call, you better be ready. And so essentially parents would tuck her in at night, put her to bed at, 9, 10 p.m., and then come wake her up at 6 a.m., right, for school. Reality is they did not come and check in between. Who does, right? But that trafficker would call, she would sneak out her window, go meet him. He would traffic her all night, drop her back off about 5:45 before mom would come and wake her up. So clearly there were some big changes in her personality, in her life. She was overly tired, but that's the reality of what was happening. Eventually, parents caught on something is very wrong, kept taking her to the ER. She's got a lot of headaches. She's got back pain. What's happening? Nobody could figure out what was going on. Eventually, someone at the hospital recognized these warning signs and were able to take next steps. If they're not able to speak for themselves, this goes with minors as well as adults. If there's someone with them that seems very controlling, when we talk to medical providers, we talk about some ways to, physically separate, those people. Or as community members, we generally say it's best to not get involved in that situation. Calling that hotline, the group that put that heat map together, that's usually that best practice there. But if they can't speak for themselves, that is a warning sign. They're not able to clarify where they are. Most of the time we talk to our kindergartners, first graders, second graders. Where do you live? What's mom's phone number, right? And if someone older than that can't answer those questions, that is a concern. Suddenly displaying expensive clothing or having a lot of money, wild parties, tattoos and branding. We don't see a ton of in our local area. It does happen. Usually, if it does happen, it's going to be kind of that shoulder area, somewhat visible, maybe arms or kind of the back of the ear. The point is that this trafficker is telling other people this is owned property. And so it's going to be probably in a semi-visible place. Some gangs will do inside the inner lip or some of those less visible places. But in our local area, we don't see a ton of that. Multiple cell phones or multiple electronic devices, I have yet to hear a good reason why someone has multiple. So far in my experience, it has always been a questionable situation. And not saying that it can't be, I just haven't heard a good reason yet. So multiple devices is always something that we can look at and question a little bit. Frequent runaways. The Department of Justice issued a statistic stating 1 out of 3 runaways will be approached by a trafficker within 48 hours. That's quick and that's a lot, right? So what we know about our foster care system is a lot of those kiddos are runners, right? They run away. And so that makes a huge vulnerability in their world. Older boyfriends or friends, unusual behavior. This can be any changes in behavior, if they were the life of the party and then now suddenly very introverted, quiet, stoic, unresponsive. That's just a warning sign of something, right? On the other side of that, if they were very, maybe quiet and hesitant to, engage, but become the life of the party, that's also just as concerning. Usually, again, that shows that there's been some type of life change, not necessarily trafficking in itself, but something is changing and something is different, right? We had a teacher who had a student, and the student was not disruptive, was not kind of those typical, aggressive behaviors, nothing like that. But she would just come to her class, in the first class of every day, she would just cry. She would just cry in the back, and again, not disruptive, but she wasn't getting her work done, and she was just crying. And so the teacher was concerned, asked her, what's going on in your world? What's happening? Nothing, I'm fine, right? Eventually, teacher keeps pushing, teacher loops in principal. Principal says, why doesn't this child come spend the first hour of the day in my office every day and we'll become friends, right? Like, let's figure out what's going on that she's not talking about. So principal essentially just made a lot of effort to become a trusted person in her life. We give her money to go get snacks for them both at the snack machine, right? Those type of things. And so eventually child does come forward and says what's happening. her stepdad is trafficking her out of the home. And at that point, the principal was able to get services, and eventually the principal actually became a foster parent, fostered this child, adopted this child, and now we have a great, beautiful story of redemption, right? But the reality is, if those individuals didn't recognize those signs, that child probably would have had a very different outcome. Frequent use of social media, we talked about that, and if they're bragging about having money. Now here, I'll just leave this slide up a little bit. This is the National Human Trafficking Hotline. These are the guys who put together that heat map. So this is a national hotline. You can always call us at Present Age Ministries as well. We're happy to talk through any situations. But the benefit of calling them is that maybe you call today and you give some of those warning signs, or maybe your gut feels like something's really wrong, so you just want to talk it through with somebody. And they say, well, thank you so much for calling, but this isn't enough information for us to open up a case with the FBI. So, have a good rest of the day. Thanks for calling. You say, okay, and you move on, right? But maybe tomorrow I'm in Atlanta and I give them a call and say, hey, something is just really wrong with this situation. Oh, look, it's the same license plate number as yesterday. Okay, well, now maybe we have enough information to put it all together and to form a case, right, that we can actually investigate. So that's the benefit of calling that hotline rather than our local agency. But again, we're always here to talk through those situations as well. Then I do see a couple questions here in the chat. Do we help with men that have been trafficked? Great question. So we work with minors. And so for those under the age of 18, the answer is no. We primarily work with females, but there is nobody that does. There was an organization a few years ago that worked with boys, but they are not around anymore. And so now there are no services in the state of North Carolina. So we will provide services if we can. Some of our programming, for example, our prevention program is really focused on a teen girl. And so that just doesn't translate to a teen boy, right? But we can provide counseling services. We can provide, right, some of those basic options that maybe could help in the situation. So we do get about 10 referrals a year. So not a ton, but it does happen to boys. For those adult serving agencies, it's a little bit easier to translate services. And so most of those agencies, especially in our local area, 821, Justice Ministries, Lily Pad Haven, I think they go by like Justice Hope Justice now. But most of those agencies do have services that can transfer. Again, with adults, it's a lot different. And so usually there are those services for men that can happen. Great question. What's the difference between sex trafficking and rape? They are very similar. So that's kind of where we go back to abuse, is that one-to-one. So rape would probably fall back into that category of sexual assault, sexual abuse. So that would be just the two people. When there's that exchange that's happening, that's exploitation. And then trafficking for adults is when that third party is involved. So with rape, it would only be that one-to-one generally, right? So trafficking is there's an exchange that's happening and a third party. So hopefully that makes sense. If not, definitely let's talk through it a little bit more in depth. Talking about the power dynamic. That's a great question. We do have a lot of our trainings, and specifically our trainings for men, talk through things like pornography, right? So that is actually the same question as the power dynamics, right? So what does pornography teach us that is real or is not real? Reality is pornography is not matching what really happens. And so a lot of pornography has violence. What we're seeing statistically now is, I think it's not, let me not say because I don't know for sure, but statistically more and more pornography has violence. What we also know is that pornography is more often than not, it's non-consensual or with a minor. So if y'all have been following Pornhub in the last year or two, probably not, but this is what I do for a living. So let me tell you what's going on. It wasn't even the United States that became a whistleblower. It was Canada's parliament that became a whistleblower. But essentially, after some time, Pornhub was required to pull down about 80% of their content because it was deemed criminal or with minors, non-consensual. So it was criminal content that was pulled down, about 80% of their content. And I think it was like 13 million videos had to be removed. And again, if it's criminal content, that would be, that's not just violent, that's not just humiliation or whatever those categories are. That is just criminal content where that individual says, I did not give permission to be in this video, or I'm a minor, please take it down. What is the percentage of girls who suffer from dissociation? Great question. Very, very high. I don't have an exact number for you, but I would say incredibly high. What we see with the clients we work with, we tend to work with them for about 18 months and kind of get them on their feet, back in school, whatever that looks like for them, if that's an alternative virtual version or something like that. We'll kind of work with them in whatever that looks like, and they're stable in a stable house, or, if that's a foster family, if that's a group home, if, whatever that looks like, we'll make sure that they're stable and they can kind of graduate from our program, right? That's kind of what we say. But reality is they never leave, right? So at that point that they graduate our program, they might be stable, but they haven't necessarily even started looking at their trauma. So that doesn't mean that we've even dealt with dissociation at that point. What we tend to see is give it 3 to 5 years and they come back. And they say, actually, I'm 17 now and I want to date a little bit, but all of the reasons that's triggering, right? And so that's usually about that time we start really digging through that process. And that's more where we deal with that dissociation and kind of dig into those things. We do have EMDR certified individuals on our team. We do have individuals that refer to neurofeedback even. And so we've really branched out a lot of how do we actually help this individual? Every story is different. Every kiddo is different. But again, usually it's kind of as they get a little bit older, then they're willing to actually look at that dissociation category of things. And what are best steps to take to spread the word about human trafficking? Great question. And this is a perfect one to end on. We have, we have a bajillion and a half handouts. We can do that digitally. Happy to get that to you any way that works best for you. I am throwing my email in there in case anyone has further questions or want to talk a little further. We definitely can do that at another time. Even just basic information, like if an individual has multiple cell phones, right? Some of those basic warning signs, being able to share that information is critical. For us, again, we've seen the 46% increase just in 2020. For us, it's at that point where we need everybody to be eyes and ears. That's in our local community. This is happening to that extreme. So the more input that we can share with people, we do awareness events for anyone and everyone. So if you want to invite us out, we're happy to have those conversations. Or if you want to be equipped, join our advocacy team. We'll train you and give you every resource that we have available. So I'll go ahead and pass this back to Justin. I know that's our time today. Thank you all for letting me go and share all of this. And as I mentioned, please feel free to email me if you have any questions or any other thoughts or just want to talk through more situations.
Thank you so
Can
much.
I ask
Tammy.
one question? Can I ask one question before she go?
Absolutely. As long as Cami has some time, yes.
Perfect.
Oh, I was just wanting to know, like, how do y'all partner with DSS or, because I know I see a lot of cases where on the news where it's been reported to DSS and it doesn't get handled or they drop the ball somewhere. So do y'all partner with DSS or?
Absolutely, yes. So we have usually 2 trainings annually. So depending, I think one is for Cabarrus County and one's for Mecklenburg County. And then anyone else who wants to join within the DSS. And then I think we also have trainings for YFS, Youth and Family Services, right, which is very similar. Depending on what county we're in, it changes. And then as soon as you get into South Carolina, it goes by region, not by county. And so we consistently, my point is we consistently do trainings with DSS or YFS so that they do identify these situations. And again, we want to be that resource that if you have a question, loop us in. One of the positive things about also, working with those who have been abused and exploited, not just trafficked, is that we can be a resource for DSS when there is just abuse, right? Or what they would just see as abuse, right? This also often presents as neglect. So when we talk to DSS specifically, we say when you would identify as the category of neglect, look a little bit deeper. Here are some of those warning signs that you're going to see from your perspective. One of our case managers was 22 years case manager for DSS. And so she's also got this really great perspective to kind of bridge the two worlds, right? She also has really equipped our team to understand when DSS can and can't get involved and what they can and can't do. I think that was really helpful for me just to understand, like you said, what I see on the news is that DSS drops the ball a lot, right? And
Right.
so help me understand why, what is that? And so she kind of has helped explain to our whole team and kind of bring our whole team on board of understanding what are those limitations, what are those processes. Then often the way DSS works is they kind of have these different protocols that some information doesn't necessarily transfer with that child. So a new DSS worker is assigned at different stages of the process. And so for us, we have our own case managers. And so essentially what we've done is been able to bridge that gap where if the child has a new DSS worker because they're in the next stage, or the family now has a different DSS point of contact, we are consistent. And so at least we can bridge the gap of that information. Maybe a parent doesn't know how to navigate this system. Why would they, right? But now
Right.
we've been experienced, we now are following that same child through the whole process. We at least get to bridge that gap and tell the new DSS worker, here's what you need to know that's not in your paperwork, right? And vice versa, that DSS worker may say, well, here's our protocol and our policies. So maybe we can get involved, maybe we can't. And then again, the positive side is that we're a nonprofit. So we don't have the red tape that law enforcement does, DSS does. They're constricted to a lot of those policies. We are constricted to doing what's best for that child. And so if that means, we step in and provide a service that we don't usually provide, for example, we had a situation where there were community concerns about a certain household. Everybody knows something very, very wrong is happening there, but no one can get their foot in the door, right? And so detectives were aware of it. People in surrounding counties are aware of this household, but no one was able to really get in there. And so what we did, and this is not a service we generally provide, but we went to one of our food pantry partners and said, hey, can we just get, some meals? They gave us meals. And so we started doing meal deliveries to this family. And again, that invited us into the home. We were able to get inside the home and kind of see what was going on. Everyone is a mandatory reporter. So, if you see a child in danger, legally, everyone has a duty of care to call law enforcement, call DSS, call somebody, call us, call somebody, right? And so for us, we were able to kind of get in the door and see what was really happening. And of course, there was a lot of issues there, but also we built trust with the family where, we're not law enforcement banging on the door. You know what I mean? We're a nonprofit who's bringing you food every week. So we're able to build a little bit of trust with some of those family members who then were able to disclose, who were then able to give us, access to law enforcement getting involved and our detectives to actually do something to pursue the case. So that's what that looks like. That's our engagement. Yes.
Okay. Thank you.
Any other questions or thoughts?
All right. Thank you so much. If anyone wants to stick around a little bit longer, you can, but thank you all for coming. Cammie, thank you so much for presenting for us, and we really look forward to working with you all in the future. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody.